Only 2% of the population is legally blind or visually impaired. Of that percentage, less than 10% of that population can read Braille. East Texas News Weekend's Avery Niles tells you more about the National Braille Literacy Month, its importance, and how technology has improved and changed the world of Braille.
Provides a powerful way to help you improve your point.
Braille is a system that is a set of 6 dots arranged in 2 columns that are raised and or flattened to alert the reader of letters and contractions in a word or sentence. Megan Aragon, the Technology Services Director at East Texas Lighthouse for the Blind, says January is National Braille Literacy Month to honor the creator of the system, Louis Braille's birthday.
It's a celebration of Braille, the fact that he created this system that allows people who are blind that either have no vision or very little usable vision to be able to read and access information.
Brittany Walters, the assistant technology instructor at the center, is a Braille reader herself and learned it in the 1st grade when she began to lose most of her sight.
Started learning Braille 1st grade with the alphabet, and then moving up to contracted Braille, and then in college learning computer Braille and all those types of things.
Every Braille reader begins learning on the Perkins Braille Writer, which looks like an old-fashioned typewriter. They then move to a Braille and Talk device that speaks back to them. As technology has advanced, there is more Braille displays that hook up to computers to help with typing in Word documents, and even a Braille note taker that acts as a computer itself.
A kiddo who is in the public school districts now, that they're handing the kids Chromebooks. Well, there's a Braille device out there, a Braille note taker that is essentially a Chromebook computer. So anything that sighted peers can do on their Chromebook, that blind child can then do on their Braille note taker.
Aragon says acknowledging and celebrating the month helps create more access for Braille readers in East Texas.
And in our community, the more access we can give to people, the better the community becomes.
Avery Niles, East Texas News Weekend.
Studies show those who are Braille literate are employed more and earn an average of $11,000 more per year than their non-Braille reading peers.